Hey everybody, welcome to Moment of Clarity. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here. Please take a minute to share the video. I got two huge guests for you for this episode. I'm talking with Ben Norton. You know him from the Gray Zone. You know him from plenty of other work. One of my favorite reporters, one of my favorite people, Ben Norton. We're going to get into a lot about Biden's foreign policy and about U.S. foreign policy and what we're doing in the world. I'm also going to, assuming everything goes as planned, talk to Sam Oser, who is in Texas right now. I believe she lives in Texas. And she is the host of Left of Liberal, but she's in Texas right now. And as you know, they are dealing with a shitstorm, almost literally. It is a storm. I don't think there's shit involved. Actually, people's pipes are exploding, and so their toilets are overflowing. So I guess that's a shit flood within a storm. It's a storm and a shit flood. Definitely a clusterfuck. That's without a doubt. So anyway, we're gonna get into all of that. But I'm going to start off with Ben Norton, but also if you're at youtube.com/moment of clarity, if that's where you're watching this, all of those super chat donations are going to mutual aid in Texas. Each week, I give those to a different mutual aid. And this week, it seemed to make sense to give it to mutual aid in Texas. So all of the donations at youtube.com/moment of clarity. If you want to donate, all the proceeds are going to mutual aid in Texas. And so please share this. Let people know. Hello, Carol. Hello, Carl. Hello, Adam Gray. Hello, Dolores. Hello, Catherine. Thanks for joining me. Please share the broadcasts. All right, let's get to it, shall we? Hey, Ben.
Hey, how's it going, Lee?
Good. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there.
You're happy you got out of the collapsing American empire, considering what's going on in Texas right now?
Oh man, just at the right time. Before the world-ending pandemic, the Texas freezing over. It's like you have like the apocalyptic bingo. It's like, which one did you have? Like 400,000 people dying, more people dying in World War II. The hottest state becoming like a frozen hellscape. It's so...
Yeah, but I did hear some Texans have been managing to shoot the icicles that are forming in their living room. So that should do it. That should fix it, I think. Thank you for joining me. I hope that the people watching are as big a fan of your work as I am. You're certainly endlessly busy. Before I get into asking you questions about all of the things that the U.S. is involved in, all the countries we're involved in collapsing or trying to collapse around the world, any updates from where you are?
Yeah, well, I actually just got back to Nicaragua. I've been living here for over a year now, and I was just in Ecuador, and I'm sure we'll probably talk a bit about that. Speaking of, the U.S. government meddling, instead of dealing with the situation at home in Texas, the U.S. is busy overthrowing foreign governments because, why would they help their own citizens?
And putting the money in the COVID relief bill, like money for creating coups in Hong Kong and elsewhere.
Yeah, well, in Ecuador, I just got back for about 2.5 weeks. I was there reporting on a historic election, and the left there's a socialist movement founded by the former president Rafael Correa, which is known as Correísmo, named after him. And he launched something called the Citizens Revolution. And it's a progressive movement with socialistic economic policies and an anti-imperialist foreign policy. And as you can guess, the U.S. is meddling to try to prevent the socialist candidate from coming back into power, even though he just won the first round of the election in a massive landslide.
Right. So he's, I suppose there were a bunch of candidates, but there were mainly three main ones, right? And he won, Arauz won 30-some%, right, of the initial election, while the closest next competitor got less than 20%. So if that were it, he would be the next president. But now we have a runoff, and it seems like the U.S., along with other right-wing forces, are trying to make the runoff as delegitimate as possible.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you can imagine from looking at U.S. elections where the candidate who gets fewer votes is often the candidate who wins. I mean, so according to that metric, the U.S. wants to, when it says it wants to spread democracy in the world, it really wants to spread its model of so-called democracy,
Right.
where the candidate with the fewer votes wins. And we see that in Ecuador. The candidate who got by far the most votes, Andrés Arauz, the leftist, got 33% of the vote. And as you mentioned, the second place candidate is a right-wing banker named Guillermo Lasso, who got just under 20%, 19 with some change. And so we're talking about a 13% massive landslide victory for the first place candidate.
Even with all the large organizations that are run against Arauz and the media, like the media hasn't basically given him any fair coverage, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I could spend the entire episode, which I won't do, or the entire interview, which I won't do, talking about the insane voter suppression we saw in Ecuador. I mean, another thing that, shared values with the U.S., massive voter suppression being overseen by the current government of Ecuador, which is a very authoritarian, very neoliberal government under the ironically named president, Lenin Moreno. And he did a 180. He was supposed to follow in the footsteps of Ecuador's socialist movement, and he betrayed everyone. It's now known that the right-wing banker, before the election, the previous election happened in 2017, which is the election that brought Lenin Moreno to power. We now know, thanks to leaks of documents, that back in 2015, the right-wing banker, Guillermo Lasso, was actually sending many millions of dollars in bribes to Lenin Moreno through offshore bank accounts. So, I mean, we're talking about extreme corruption, and a lot of that corruption goes through Panama with all of the bank accounts there, which are very, it's like the Switzerland of Latin America. So in the case of the election here, or in the case of election there in Ecuador, what happened is that also on election day, there were insanely long lines. And what a coincidence. The long lines were in poor and working class neighborhoods, which are the base of the socialist Correísta movement. Whereas I was in the capital Quito, and I went to 4 different precincts, and in the middle class and upper middle class precincts, and the middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods, the precincts had very short lines. So there's clearly voter suppression that was going on. Some people who waited
to see the U.S. exporting our form of democracy, quote unquote, around the world. Don't let poor people vote.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it make you feel proud to be an American?
Yeah.
Proud to be an American. So, and then there's also the voter suppression in the sense that the National Electoral Council, which is the electoral body overseeing the election in Ecuador, the CNE, it is run by a very corrupt politician who is a member of the third place candidate's political party, Yacu Perez. I can talk a bit about that in a second, but I don't want to get too complex here. And then the CNE under her leadership, well, actually, the CNE first, the Lenin Moreno administration, backed by the U.S., purged all of the electoral body members who were suspected of being sympathetic to the Correísta movement, which is incredible because remember, Republicans were always like, Democrats, they're gonna stack the courts, as if Democrats would ever grow a spine and actually like have enough bravery to even attempt something like that.
Right.
Meanwhile, in Ecuador, they purged everyone who was sympathetic to the Correísta movement and stacked all the courts in the electoral body with right-wing people from the main opposition parties. And surprise, surprise, the electoral body put all these obstacles up to preventing the left from even being able to participate in the election. So they banned Rafael Correa, the most popular politician in the country, from being able to participate in the election. He couldn't run for president because he already served 2 terms, but he was going to try to be vice president, and they banned him from being the candidate. Then they banned the political party used by Andrés Arauz. So he had to use another political party that was little known. There was another politician who was slightly sympathetic. So there was that. And then furthermore, because they just kept trying to prevent the left from participating, and so they would adapt to the situation. So then they would find a new obstacle. And then finally, like 2 weeks before the election, the electoral body announced that Andrés Arauz could, and all of the candidates from his movement, could no longer use the ads that they had they had to stop showing all of their video ads and their print
Really?
ads if they had the face of Correa, the former president, in it. And of course, they all had the face of Correa.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. And yet still, Arauz comes out with a victory. As we said, 30-some% compared to below 20 for the next two. And to talk about Yaku Perez for a second, you tweeted out that so Lasso is kind of more obviously corrupt. He's a banker. It's more obvious that he's a neoliberal. But with Perez, it's a little more complicated for people. And you tweeted that the fact that people outside of the country think he's progressive shows how effective corporate media propaganda has been.
Yeah, honestly, if you had to make a comparison, it's never 1-to-1, but you could say that Lasso is kind of like a Republican candidate and Yaku Perez is like a Democrat. And he's using the same tactics of the Democrats with like using kind of like a neoliberal identity politics because he's from an indigenous community. So even though he was never involved in indigenous politics until a few years ago when he decided to grow his hair out and like and dress differently and stop wearing glasses, like these like nerdy glasses. I mean, back in 2017, he ran and he just looked like a typical neoliberal candidate. I mean,
it sounds similar to why they picked Juan Guaido for the coup leader, because he has slightly darker skin.
Yeah, in fact, what's incredible is we now know that even though this pissed off Trump, one of the reasons they picked Guaido is because he was like the most similar to Obama. And Yaku Perez is also very much like an Obama figure. I've been saying that he's like an indigenous version of Obama, Kamala Harris, and Pete Buttigieg all combined. Like that's like the same politics that they're going for.
Sounds like a wonderful Voltron. Sounds very exciting. So
yeah, I mean, wait, a quick idea of, I mean, so he used to kind of portray himself as progressive, but I mean, he supported many coups in the region. He supported the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia, which was like the most kind of textbook fascist coup. But as an example of like his fake progressive politics, which is just like, I mean, you have to laugh at how overt it is. In an interview, Yaku Perez was asked what he thought about this proposal that Andres Arauz had. Arauz said, to kickstart the economy, we want to give 1 million poor and working class families in Ecuador $1,000 checks. Which, by the way, is pretty incredible because in the U.S., we can't even get $2,000 checks. And the U.S. is the richest country in the world. Whereas in Ecuador, the minimum wage is $400 a month. So $1,000, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a shit ton. That'd be like sending Americans $10,000 or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So Yaku Perez said, no, I don't support that policy because if you give a lot of poor people these checks, then they're going to spend all the money on alcohol overnight. Like in one night, they're going to buy too much beer. And then a few days ago,
that's the same garbage that half of America said, oh, I don't want to give a dime to a homeless person. He might use it for beer, you know. And even
and then like
my view
10 minutes later, they buy a $20 drink at some overpriced bar.
The other thing is my view is even if the guy on the street did use the dollar for beer, God bless him. All right, he got a beer. I mean, you don't think his life has difficulties? Maybe he wants a beer. We all want a beer.
He could use that beer much more than I could, man. Like,
yeah. So to move on from Ecuador in a second. So the runoff is coming up in April. Has there been any development on which one of them will be against Arauz?
Well, I mean, it keeps changing every few days. It's pretty wild. So first, Yaku Perez and Guillermo Lasso formed an alliance, and now they're fighting again, and who knows what will happen. But I mean, a lot of people in Ecuador I spoke to are honestly not confident that they'll even have the runoff in April. If people remember, in Bolivia, they delayed the election 3 times.
Right.
And the only reason there was an election, the U.S., of course, supported the delays. The only reason there was an election is because the indigenous majority of Bolivia and also non-indigenous working class people, they mobilized and had a massive strike, and they shut down the country, and the government was just unable to govern. So they were forced to have an election. So we'll see what happens in Ecuador, but I'll say that the role of the Biden administration has been totally to support the anti-Correa opposition forces. The State Department released these insanely ridiculous tweets saying that they support the electoral body's attempt to be transparent, to have a new recount. It's like they don't need a recount. We know who won.
Right.
Why would we need a recount? But we know what the U.S. role is throughout Latin America.
Right. And in fact, Lenin Moreno was here the week before the first election, working with Biden to, I don't know, try and find a way to upend the election.
No,
but
they were trying to be as democratic as possible. That's why you go to Washington and have closed door meetings with Luis Almagro, the head of the OAS, who organized a coup in Bolivia 2 years ago. I mean, totally normal behavior.
Yeah, you just arrive in DC and they just give you a sack of freedom of speech. They just have it and they dish it out for you to take home. So we've
along with the sack
about
of missiles that they just sold to Chile. And
well, that's what I said. Freedom of speech, missiles, same idea.
Yeah.
So Bolivia, most people know, had this horrible fascist right-wing coup. They since, like you said, succeeded in actually having a legit election despite all odds, and threw out their U.S.-backed coup mongers. And you just tweeted that breaking news about Bolivia and the massive amount of money they owe to the IMF. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, surprise, a pattern in Latin America is that when there are free and fair elections, these socialist and progressive leaders win the election in a landslide, and they say, we refuse to pay this odious debt that's left behind from the International Monetary Fund, which is basically controlled by the U.S. The U.S. has veto power over the IMF. It has its origins in the Bretton Woods system, created immediately after World War II, when the Western colonial powers created this financial infrastructure with the US dollar as the kind of global reserve currency. And so the IMF has a long history. If anyone's ever heard of it, you can check out, there's a really good book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Yeah,
going into how
I highly recommend it. And it was one of the earlier books that woke me up to the dynamics that are beyond just kind of standard mainstream left media.
Yeah, absolutely. So long story short is that what happens is that these poor countries in the global south, they want to develop, and it's really hard to develop on a balanced budget, as we can see in states in the US, because they're forced to maintain these balanced budgets. Most countries that develop, they actually develop with a deficit. So you're spending more than you have, but then you're using that debt to invest in new forms of growth. And then once you grow, you get more revenue, and then use that revenue to pay off your debt. Well, what happens is that these corrupt neoliberal governments in Latin America will use these huge loans from the International Monetary Fund that indebts the country, and then the country can't pay off the debt. And it's one that the money is often going into the pockets of these corrupt elites. So we see with Lenin Moreno, he took more than $6 billion of loans from the IMF, which is a ton of money for a poor country like Ecuador. And
within 2 weeks of getting that loan, gave Julian Assange up to the British police.
Absolutely. That was part of the deal, right? And then meanwhile, what did he use that money for? He didn't use it to build infrastructure. He didn't use it to fund healthcare and education. It went into the pockets of him and his corrupt, rich, elite friends. And we now know, because of these leaks called the INA papers, it shows that all this money was stolen. Anyway, the long story short is that that's what these corrupt governments do in the region. And then what happens is that the IMF says that in order to pay off the debt, you have to impose structural adjustment, which is the nice way of saying just austerity, just cutting social benefits, telling poor people, tough luck, you got to work harder, we're not going to give you any support.
Right.
And so what happens is that these left-wing governments come in and they say, no, we didn't negotiate the IMF debt. That was negotiated under this unpopular neoliberal regime. So for instance, in Ecuador, Lenin Moreno has 8% approval, and he's the one who negotiated all this stuff. So if Arauz wins the election, he has promised he's not going to pay the IMF debt. Instead, he's going to work with China to have loans. And similarly, in Bolivia, the elected leader who's from the Movement Towards Socialism party, his name is Luis Arce. One of his campaign promises was, he said, we're not going to pay the IMF debt. This is odious debt brought on by an unelected right-wing coup regime, and they didn't even use the money to benefit the poor people of the country. They used it just to enrich themselves and steal. I mean, basically, the IMF knows this, and what the IMF does is they say, we're going to give you debt or a loan, And the loan is just a bribe to rich people. They steal the money, and then the country's indebted. So then if a left-wing government comes ever into power, they're not able to implement their progressive policies because they have so many billions of dollars in debt. So what happened is these presidents said, fine, screw this. We're just not going to pay the debt. We're not even going to try to pay the debt. We're just going to say, screw you, IMF. We're going to China, or we're going to another country, usually China or Russia, who can give us loans. And then we're going to try to have our own economic program. And in Bolivia, that's exactly what they did. And in Ecuador, that's what they're trying to do. That's what Andrés Arauz wants to do. But of course, that's one of the several reasons the U.S. wants to prevent them from coming into power.
And correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't one of Correa's big accomplishment was getting out from under IMF debt initially?
Yeah, I mean, that's what all of these progressive leaders in Latin America do. Also in Argentina, you had the husband and wife progressive duo of the Kirchners, and Nestor and Cristina Kirchner. And both of them, they got off of the kind of neo-colonial debt bondage of the IMF and made their country economically solvent, and then used the wealth to benefit progressive programs and fund social programs for people. And then there came in Argentina a right-wing neoliberal government under this leader, Mauricio Macri, who also had like 15% approval rating. So we're seeing a pattern here, single or like teen percentage approval rating of these neoliberal presidents. And in the case of Macri, he took the largest IMF loan in history, $56 billion. And Argentina is richer than Ecuador, but still, it's not at the level of the US. It's an insane amount of money. And then what happens is now there's a progressive government in Argentina, but it's not as anti-imperialist and socialist as Correa was. So now in Argentina, instead of saying, screw the IMF, we're not going to pay it, they've been trying to renegotiate the debt under the progressive government of Alberto Fernandez. And it's really screwed up the economy. There's large inflation going on in Argentina. Social services are really weak right now. So we just see that, imperialism is not just invading a country. I mean, that's like the last go-to strategy. If you try everything else and nothing else works, like they tried to do in Venezuela, and they were considering a military intervention. Well, the levels before that is that you just trap these countries in neo-colonial debt bondage, and they can never get out of it.
Yeah, I'd say in general, that's probably the more effective and more commonly used tool of the U.S. empire than straight up, assassination or invasion. I want to get
that Democrats often like more, because they know that like a Bush style Iraq invasion is very bad. I mean, it just looks bad, the marketing.
Right.
So instead, the Democrats are like, oh no, we'll just give them IMF loans, and that's their version.
Also, they end up in this position where they have to pretend as if, oh, well, we've invaded the country, but now we're letting them go be their own selves. But of course, you can't do that because the puppet governments you put in will always stray. Things will always happen. And so, they end up with like Afghanistan, where they're like, well, no, we're ending the war, but we're going to have thousands of peacemakers there. It is more of a mess. I wanted to move on to something else you tweeted, which, by the way, everyone should follow Ben's Twitter account. It's one of the most efficient and accurate critiques of the empire going. I think it's Benjamin Norton. Is that the Twitter? Yeah. You tweeted about, which I knew very little about this, but about the man who risked life in prison to hack the materials about Brazil's anti-corruption trial to bring down Lula. Is that correct? And he's criticizing The Intercept, and yet again for only publishing a small percentage, which is the same thing they did with the Snowden files.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Brazil, it's part of the same pattern here, right? So there was a progressive movement that came in under the party called the Workers' Party. So what happened is that actually we just had the anniversary in the 1990s. A group of labor organizers, unions, professors, intellectuals, leftists formed an independent party. Like there's an attempt going on in the US called the Workers' Party, and they grew and grew in Brazil, and they ended up taking power. And the most popular president in Brazilian history, named Lula da Silva, was president for 2 terms, and then his successor, the first female president in the history of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party, she was president. And they implemented a very ambitious program of funding social programs, fighting poverty, increasing literacy, all of these great progressive programs. And of course, they also had a very anti-imperialist foreign policy, which is what pissed off the US. They were working with Venezuela and other socialist governments in the region. They were working more closely with China and Russia. In fact, Brazil was part of the BRICS system, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which was an attempt to challenge the IMF and challenge the World Bank by creating a whole new developmental bank that countries in the global South could use instead of the IMF. So what happened is that the US and the right-wing oligarchy in Brazil, which is very extreme, and the current far-right president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who's even more fascistic than Trump was, he represents like the racist, colonial oligarchy in Brazil, which is one of the most extreme in all of Latin America because there's a history of a lot of Nazis and fascists after World War II. They immigrated to Brazil. They fled to Brazil.
And just straight out disgust for the indigenous people in Brazil. I mean, basically, it's hardly even coded his messaging about, killing the indigenous and burning down the rainforests.
Yeah, he called himself Captain Chainsaw proudly because he said he's an anti-environmentalist proudly. And not even just anti-indigenous. In Brazil, over half of the population is of African descent, is what we in the US would consider black. And they're extreme. I mean, Jair Bolsonaro is light skinned. He's as white as you and I, and he's really racist against black people. And said that if one of his sons married a black woman, he would be disgusted. So I mean, so he represents the kind of Brazilian oligarchy, and the U.S. collaborated with them to try to overthrow the Workers' Party government, and they succeeded. And in order to do it, they used this astroturfed operation, which began under Obama. It actually all happened under Obama, called Lava Jato, that claimed to be an anti-corruption investigation. So they accused the Workers' Party, which was, even according to like their own measurement, it was like the 8th most corrupt party in the entire country, as opposed to like Bolsonaro's party, which is one of the most corrupt. So they went after the Workers' Party and accused Lula da Silva, like the least corrupt politician in all of Brazil, who had over 80% approval rating when he left office. We're talking about one of the most popular leaders in the entire world. And they imprisoned him on bogus charges of corruption after they impeached the president Dilma Rousseff, the elected president, on also equally bogus charges of corruption. It was a coup. And then after her, they installed this neoliberal, the same pattern I just talked about, who took on all this debt, who privatized all the social programs and cut programs for poor people. His name was Michel Temer. They imprisoned Lula da Silva on the fake corruption charges. And then, surprise, surprise, Jair Bolsonaro comes into power. Well, what we now know, thanks to this hacker, this Brazilian hacker who wasn't even that political, actually, but he was just so disgusted by what happened. And he was actually, he was imprisoned. The police in Brazil are very corrupt. So he was imprisoned on fake accusations that he had drugs, which were planted in his apartment. And he was imprisoned, and he got so mad that he started hacking all of the judges because he wanted revenge. And he found all of these messages. He wasn't even a Workers' Party supporter, but he found messages showing that what the cops did to him is what they did to Lula. They imprisoned him on fake charges, and he was so angry that he got all these like terabytes. We're talking about like millions of messages, and was trying to leak them. And he went to The Intercept, which has a Brazil office, which is very popular in Brazil. And they only published a very small percentage of the leaks.
They did a good job at first, right? Glenn Greenwald kind of led the charge to have this revealed about the operation to bring down Lula. And it had huge ramifications in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to Glenn, I mean, he didn't say this, but what I think probably happened is that it's public knowledge that Brazil was actually charged. There was a case against him by the Bolsonaro regime. So, I mean, they were going to try to imprison him for doing this journalism. And they eventually dropped the case. So I think that, Glenn, I didn't talk to Glenn about this. He didn't tell me anything. What I suspect is that either Glenn was being threatened and decided not to pursue the case further, or there was some kind of agreement made to not charge him if he agreed to. We don't entirely know what happened. But the reality is that, I mean, Glenn Greenwald is not the only person at The Intercept Brazil. They have an entire office, and they have all of these documents, and then they just stopped publishing them.
And since that time, Glenn has left the Intercept because they tried to censor him, refused to publish some articles that would have looked bad for Joe Biden and his son. And so as Glenn would say, there are clear problems with The Intercept.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not blaming Glenn for this. I mean, like I said, Glenn
No,
did great work.
I know. No.
And Glenn is one person. They have a huge office in Brazil. It's funded by this billionaire Pierre Omidyar. And what are they doing? So, but what we do know now is that because Lula da Silva's legal team is suing the government because they say correctly that he was imprisoned on specious fake charges for political reasons. And that was the reason that he wasn't allowed to be the presidential candidate. Because if he had been the presidential candidate, Bolsonaro never would have become president. Lula would be president right now. So it was part of a coup. Well, his legal team has been suing for all of the documents, and they've been slowly leaked to his legal team, which means that other journalists finally are getting access to these documents that The Intercept didn't release. So now other websites have released documents, for instance, showing that the CIA was involved, surprise, surprise, in another coup in Latin America. And the CIA and the FBI and the DOJ in general were all involved in this fake anti-corruption investigation. Every 2 weeks, the FBI would meet with the Brazilian prosecutors to discuss the case. So they were basically just giving them a list of left-wing politicians to imprison on fake charges of corruption. This is all under the Obama DOJ, by the way, the Obama-Biden DOJ. As they're if you've noticed, like they've been rewriting history, and anytime they used to say Obama administration, it's always now Obama Biden administration to try to give Biden credit. And I'll give Biden credit for this. We now know that one of the main judges overseeing Lava Jato, one of his messages that was just released, he said, thank the CIA for imprisoning Lula.
Wow. Well, I'll only go one more minute because I don't want to keep the next guest waiting too long. I'll have to have you back on to talk about a lot more of this. But 1 minute thoughts on how awesome the Joe Biden foreign policy has been thus far.
Oh, I'll give you a 1 minute summary. supporting a right-wing dictator in Haiti, trying to help steal the election from a popular socialist in Ecuador, expanding the military occupation of northeastern Syria, expanding military presence in Iraq. Who knows what they're doing with the Iran nuclear deal? It seems like one day they're trying to destroy it. The next day they say they want to go back to it. I mean, you can go down the list of all
ending troop withdrawal in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, expanding troop presence in Somalia. I mean, the last comment I'll say here is that I've been saying this a lot in my interviews that, there's this quote that's often attributed, probably falsely, to Einstein, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, I would extend that and say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again with the same exact people who were in the Obama administration and expecting different results.
Very true. Very true.
Power. I mean, all those people are back.
Yeah, I know. Victoria Nuland.
Sullivan.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben. What's the best place for people to follow all your work? The Gray Zone?
Yeah, The Gray Zone, gray with an A. It's thegrayzone.com.
Thanks so much. I'll definitely have to have you back again. It's good to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And keep up the awesome work. You're one of the only other journalists talking about this stuff. So, and in a way that's funny too. So surprised, we all need more of a sense of humor because otherwise I'd just kill myself. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, man. I hear you. Keep fighting out there.
See ya.
Okay, so that was Ben Norton. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to bring on the next guest now. Also, all of the donations at youtube.com/moment of clarity all the proceeds are going to mutual aid in Texas. So if you want to throw a couple of bucks over there, that will go to mutual aid in Texas. Please take a second to share this, let people know, and you can always get these videos almost every day at leecamp.com. My next guest is in Texas, and she is the host of Left of Liberal. Please welcome Sam Ozer.
Hi.
Did I pronounce your last name right?
You did. You did. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I don't know about, obviously most of us know about what's going on in Texas to some degree, but I don't know about your personal situation. How have you been?
I've been okay. We've definitely been one of the luckier folks down here in Texas. Our neighborhood got hit pretty hard most everybody on our street had busted pipes. This week was a lot of disaster recovery, a lot of cleaning up, because ceilings were just fell in because pipes busted. But luckily we are okay.
Is that's connected to them freezing, or?
Yes, yeah, it's connected to them freezing. What happened? So the electricity, they turned off the electricity, and the water was still going. But then they turned off the water lines, because the way they set up the water is people were still dripping it, and it was causing low water pressure within the storage tanks. So they just turned off people's water, and then in our neighborhood, they turned it back on without telling anybody, and pipes bursted because the pipes were frozen because there wasn't electricity. It's like the cycle. Like, it was just a fun little cycle.
Wow. Yeah. And so what city are you in, by the way?
I am in Houston. I'm like in a suburb of Houston, but I'm in the same county. So Houston is in Harris County, which is the third most populous county in the United States. And I'm in a suburb of that county. I'm not far from Houston, though.
Gotcha. And so I covered this yesterday on the live stream, but they cut off the power because they said they were minutes from the entire system collapsing to such a degree that it would be months before a lot of people would get power back.
No, yeah, definitely. And like, yesterday was the first day I really had internet. So I was doing research on like who controls our power grid and things like that. Things that I feel like I maybe should have known.
ERCOT, right?
ERCOT.
Sounds like something that you say when you're choking, which is probably appropriate.
It does. It's an acronym. It's for environmental reliability, and then something. I get lost after reliability.
Those two words sound like propaganda garbage to begin with.
Exactly. Like, once you get to R, like, nothing else matters, because reliability is just such garbage. But so they are nonprofit, and they've been around since the 1970s. But they didn't start controlling the Texas electric grid until 2002. So I learned that back in 1996, California was the first state to deregulate their electric market. But what they saw happening, like, immediately, was the capitalists who own these power companies, to diversify the choice, besides having one electric company, they were bidding. They were doing bidding wars. So instead of it being like a dollar per megawatt, it would go up to like 15,000 per megawatt. So California was like, immediately, we can't do this. A lot of states that were
that was connected to the Enron chaos too, wasn't it?
Yes, actually, Enron was directly involved with creating the deregulation of this. So most other states were like, we're just going to reverse our deregulation, and we're going to keep being regulated. But George W. Bush, and who was governor of Texas at the time, and Enron were like, hold my beer, Texas, we're just going to keep deregulating. And so they did, and they appointed ERCOT to manage the electrical grid. But like, I shit you not, I don't know if I'm supposed to cuss, but in the pilot program, whenever they had ERCOT on here, there were blackouts like almost immediately. And then they were moving from $1, they were misprojecting $1 megawatt to 15,000 a megawatt. And like, they saw this happening, and they're like, oh, this is already going bad in the pilot program, but what's the chances of it actually going bad? So they handed the electrical grid to ERCOT, and that was in 2002. In 2005, ERCOT had six of their executives criminally charged for Operation Fraud case. So this has just been like a historically ongoing thing. And then, this week we learned.
And so just to clarify, even though ERCOT is a nonprofit, a lot of people make a lot of money from this.
Yes, yeah. And well, the thing about nonprofits that I'm really starting to learn is that under this colonial white supremacy system, yada yada, the nonprofits really serve as an arm for corporate interests.
Right.
And you just start seeing more and more of that. If you're a nonprofit and you're complicit in the system and the power dynamics of it, you're going to be more successful. But if you're a nonprofit really trying to make a difference and trying to remedy the effects of capitalism or even change the capitalist system itself,
Right.
you're going to get blundered. Like that's just.
It's not far off from like FERC, the agency, the federal agency that decides whether oil and gas can drill or put in pipelines. They're not, FERC is not making profit, but who gets onto the FERC board is usually people that used to be connected to oil and gas, and they then approve all the permits. They approve something like 99%. So they are furthering the corporate profit, corporate extraction system, even though the FERC agency itself is not the one making the profit.
Exactly. And this ERCOT board is a nonprofit. It's not anybody that voters elect. And people on the board represent different factions of the Texas electrical supply. Natural gas, which they made a shit ton of money this week. They called it the jackpot.
Yeah. As people are dying, they're celebrating.
Yeah, they really were. And then we have nuclear and of course oil. And okay, so here's the fun part. And I just really okay, so ERCOT themselves, I got stuck on a wire. ERCOT themselves said in a tweet that they had some additional output that they could use that came from wind and solar. They tweeted this themselves, and the Republicans are over here saying, this would get worse under the Green New Deal, wind and solar, blah, blah, blah. When ERCOT themselves, the people who are already mismanaging the system, said they had additional input from solar and wind. So,
yeah. They're trying to, the right wing is trying to blame wind power and green power. If you turn on Fox News, they're going on and on about a frozen wind turbine somewhere. When in fact, I mean, to begin with, wind is only 15% of Texas's energy. And then on top of that, wind is producing fine. It's been the other areas that this system has been collapsing.
Well, and they weren't winterized. So a lot of the generators and our whole electrical grid was not winterized because they were cutting costs and cutting corners.
And because they don't believe in climate chaos. So.
Yes. Yeah. Well, climate change isn't real. So
right.
Why would they? This week, I think it was yesterday. Time doesn't exist anymore, but I'm pretty sure it was yesterday.
Pandemic time is very different.
Well, you have pandemic time and then you have climate apocalypse time. It's like a 7-layer dip of existential crisis,
Right.
Great. But so we are actually in the middle of a legislative session in Texas. So this week, I think it was yesterday, they actually put in bills to winterize and fix what they've left.
Time.
Yeah, what they've been like jerking off about for like the last 20 years. And what's really angering is like, I know these people are going to raise taxes in some way and put the burden on the working class to pay for the mistake that they should have done a long time ago. Now, not all of Texas is managed by this ERCOT group. El Paso is on the federal grid and they didn't lose power once. Yeah. And I found a map on like Power Wizard. It was one of those electrical companies where you could see where in Texas was regulated and where was deregulated. And like the way they positioned this, like, why would they deregulate to begin with? So capitalists like to try to give the illusion of choice, right? And their tagline was, you have the power to choose. You have the electric choice. You can get the most competitive pricing out of this. But what that basically equated to was higher prices than you would have under one electrical company. It's been insane.
Yeah, the illusion of choice is very useful. You have 3 people exploiting you. Which one would you like to pick to exploit you? Oh, good choice. Then it's freedom, right? You got to choose your exploitation.
Yes. Yeah. And it really permeates everywhere. Like just when I think like, okay, the illusion choice is over here. The illusion of choice is over here. And now we're even seeing it play out in basic necessities at this point. So like 25 people died in Texas, some from hyperthermia, some because they didn't have access to meds, some from carbon monoxide poisoning because they were trying to stay warm in their housing.
Right.
I saw one this week where the house burned down and 3 kids died along with the grandma in the house because they were trying to keep warm. And it's just, it's absolutely infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, this should be like of a functional government, of a non-corrupt, non-capitalist government. A functioning government this would be one of its priorities, is how do we establish a society that is ready for a crisis, where neighbors know who to turn to in case of crisis. Like that should be ostensibly like one of the main reasons for a government in a society. And instead, we have the reverse, which is a government that's mainly built around how can we exploit and extract the resources and the money from people. So therefore, there's no need to prepare for crisis because crisis can usually make a lot of money for people. So.
Well, and then take it a step further, add police state and fascism in it. Across the state, when people are trying to go to the grocery store, they are getting policed in lines. Our Houston chief, Art Acevedo, he started saying that he's going to have cops out in plain clothes monitoring neighborhoods and apartment complexes to make sure nothing goes wrong. There we have the illusion of protection. Right. And police departments across the state are doing that. And it's just like this whole other level too, especially, where Black and brown people are already getting disenfranchised from the pandemic. And from, since, Black and brown people are statistically in lower income neighborhoods, well, they're going to get even more affected by this dress rehearsal of a climate apocalypse. And they have the police like even more into their space.
And then you see how the rich respond to this. Ted Cruz flies to Cancun with his family because they can just fly away from climate apocalypse, from climate chaos, but the poor cannot.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it boils down to. Boil right now is a pun because we're having to boil.
Yeah, you got to boil your water. So I guess last question will be where do things stand right now? Is it so you're still boiling your water, or how's that going?
Everyone's still having to boil their water. Electricity is on for the most part. There's still some parts of Houston and Harris County that don't have electricity. Some of the more rural parts, some of the poorer parts.
What's the temperature?
The temperature right now, oh God, it's not even that cold. It's 47.
Oh, wow. All right. So you're already heating up.
We're already heating up. And like we were under 32 degrees for about 3 days. And then last night we had a hard freeze. I think we're going to have another hard freeze tonight going into tomorrow morning. But the hard freezes now are a lot more sparse than it was before. And right now, everybody's just mad, and political theater is happening right now. The Democrats, the corporate Democrats, are pointing fingers at the Republicans. The Republicans are gaslighting effectively. And we're just seeing a lot of political theater play out at the moment. But by this time next week, it'll have washed and cycled through the news cycle, and we'll be back to whatever bullshit they decide to put up next. And like the thing is too, like another point is people are still recovering from Hurricane Harvey. Actually, about a month ago, I just reported on this group called Harvey's Forgotten Survivors Caucus. and some of them still have mold in their houses. So it's just disaster after disaster down here. And there's this journalist down here in Texas, down here in Houston, who's a corporate journalist. And he said, we keep limping through disasters, like what gives? And I told him,
why is that?
Why is that? So I retweeted, I was like, it's all by design, and we have to stop treating it like it's not. Like we have to just stop being neutral for just a second to just really see how it's all by design. And we have to call it out, and we have to do it collectively. And I'm just so ready. Like if we would have gone out with like months of power, I think Texas would have started like the general strike. But I think they've been doing a good job of, I say good job, of hurting the masses and giving PR talking points to make people comfortable.
Redirecting the anger to something that works better for the ruling elite.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hang in there. I hope things get better soon. Hope you get some clean water soon.
There is definitely, I will say, there's a lot of mutual aid effort going down here. And these mutual aid networks were built before this happened.
Right.
Actually, we saw a lot of mutual aid movement happen during the George Floyd protests last year. So we have existing mutual aid networks. Mutual Aid Houston is a good one. And once you go on to, like, once you see them, you'll see all the different ones that we have in the area. But it's going. It's doing the thing, and I'm definitely one of the luckier ones, but it's just like, God, what gives?
I know. It is a fight, but so yeah, by the way, you mentioned mutual aid. All the donations, if people want to donate, are going to mutual aid from the super chat today, tomorrow, all this week, to Texas Mutual Aid. And but I want people to, I noticed from the comments, a lot of people want to continue to follow your stuff. Is the best place at Sam the Mullet?
It is, yeah. And that's my handle on all social channels. You can use that on Clubhouse, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Yeah.
Wibbly Rockets? Are you on Wibbly Rockets?
I'm not on Wibbly. What is Wibbly? That sounds like
made it up.
Name.
So yeah, okay. And your show is called Left of Liberal on All Real Radio.
Yeah, All Real Radio is a small little podcast studio out of Third Ward, and I report there every Saturday at 1 p.m. And it also goes live on my Facebook page, and that's about it. And then I have a Medium profile. It's also samthemullet.medium.com, I guess now. I probably should switch to some Substack at some point, but I just, at some point, maybe, I don't know. But
that's all right. You can't keep up with everything every minute.
There's just so many Wibbly Rockets now.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not on Wibbly Rockets, then what's the point?
What's the point?
Plus, you got to get some Wibbly crypto. Thanks so much, Sam. I really appreciate coming on short notice. I'd love to have you back sometime soon. So please keep me updated on your work.
Yeah, no problem. You have a good one. How do I get out of here? Oh, leave soon.
See you soon.
Got you. Bye.
How do I get out of here? That's the line of the interview. I always like when I have guests, they're like, how do I get the fuck out? I'm trapped on a Lee Camp live stream. Oh, fuck. A fate worse than hell. I've been trapped on the live stream. Thank you guys for joining me. I do these every single weekday, every fucking one. Except sometimes. And they're at leecamp.com. And that was Sam Oser and Ben Norton. I hope you follow both of them on the social media channels. But please share this video. And I have a newish Rockfin channel, rockfin.com/leecamp. You can go over there, sign up over there, get premium content, all that good shit. New Redacted tonight. How about that? That's coming out tonight. New Redacted tonight. At youtube.com/redacted tonight. Or if you want to watch the whole episode, you can get it at portable.tv. All right, guys. As we can tell, things are getting interesting. Things are getting ugly, but I'm going to keep fighting. I hope you'll keep fighting. Talk soon.